Welcome to the Season 2 of the India Energy Hour podcast. The India Energy Hour podcast explores the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities of India's energy transition through an in-depth discussion on policies, financial markets, social movements, and science. The podcast is hosted by energy transition researcher and author Dr. Sandeep Pai and senior energy and climate journalist Shreya Jay. The show is produced by multimedia journalist Tejas Dayananda Sagar.
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, released a report recently that made global headlines. One fact from the report came out as a dire warning. Over 40% of the world's population are highly vulnerable to climate change. However, there is much more in this report, which was authored by 270 researchers from 67 countries. The report explains the global and regional impacts of climate change, evaluates the adaptation efforts, and explains the vulnerabilities faced by humans with rising temperatures. To understand what this IPCC report says climate change could and is costing Indians, we interviewed Chandni Singh, senior researcher at Indian Institute for Human Settlements. Chandni is one of the co-authors of the IPCC report and has authored many other important reports on the topics ranging from climate change, adaptation, vulnerability, migration to livelihoods.
Hi, Chandni. Welcome to the India Energy Hour. It's great to have you with us. We are very delighted to have you here on the show to talk about this very, very important topic, and which is so timely. You have just been part of this great report, which has brought to fore so many issues related to climate mitigation and adaptation. So we are really looking forward to talk to you about that. But before we delve deep into this issue, why not let's know about yourself? Tell us about yourself, your professional journey. Where did you study? How did you decide to enter into this area? I know it's a very exciting area to be in at current moment, of course, and we're very thankful to you to be part of this area, especially as a women professional as well. How did you decide to enter into this space? What led you to enter into this space? If you can tell us some anecdotes, some people, some driving factors which were responsible for that.
Thanks so much for inviting me to this podcast. I've been listening to you all for some time now, so it's really exciting to be part of it. All right, it's a nice question to start with and just gives one a chance to reflect on one's own journey. I have always been interested in nature in general. My grandfather was a forest officer, so I've grown up with stories of just how he managed forest conservation. I grew up in Mussoorie. The beginning of my childhood was quite idyllic, actually, growing up in Mussoorie, where my mother used to teach in a school. And so I would just be walking around, trekking on hills, collecting wildflowers. So I've always been very connected to nature, I would say. And that led me to take up botany as my undergraduate degree. It wasn't as exciting as I hoped it would be. It was a lot of fungus and moss and those kinds of things. We had actual papers or whatever subjects on these topics. But it also helped me, gave me a sense of the natural world, how it functions, and then how human beings are really affecting the natural world in very negative ways. After that, I was torn between sitting for the forest exams, actually, the services, joining the Indian Forest Service, but chose instead to go for a master's in natural resource management at TERI. TERI at that time was the only place really in India that offered such a course. I was the second batch of TERI, so it was also very early. I think no one was really talking about climate change unless, in the public. I think it was just climate scientists talking about it. And that too, it was climate science. So, how is the monsoon changing? How are droughts changing? So a lot of meteorologists talking about it, but not so many social scientists. So I did a master's in natural resource management. It exposed me to ideas of, things like governing natural resources. How do you manage forests and water and land? Those kinds of questions. Where do people come into this whole story? We had a lot on biodiversity conservation, which was really, it was of interest to me in particular. And of course, we had a great set of people talking about climate change. TERI used to bring in a lot of so TERI is a university, but it's also an organization. And the organization has a lot of leading climate experts in India working there. So we had a lot of guest lectures from them, which exposed me to these ideas of climate change. And after TERI, there were really, at that time, there weren't many jobs in the sector. So there were two routes people would take. One was get into these big consultancies like KPMG and PwC, where you work on CDM, or the Clean Development Mechanism, which was about carbon credits and trading and having projects around that. That did not excite me at all. And the second route was to work with civil society organizations, NGOs, really looking at climate change on the ground, but also not only climate change. I think environmental change is what I would say, just erosion of forests and land degradation and things like that. So I joined an NGO called Pragya right after my master's. And again, it was just a tremendous opportunity. They work only in the high altitude Himalayas, right from Ladakh in Jammu and Kashmir to Tawang and Bomdila in Arunachal Pradesh. So I spent a couple of great years visiting these places, implementing projects on wetland management, on conserving that, green spaces, things like that, planting trees, talking to women self-help groups, to grow medicinal plants that only grow in the high altitude Himalayas. So these were all above 8,000 feet. So even getting to some of these villages required a 2-day trek. It was a phenomenal insight into, I think, communities that are living at the front line of climate change. Climate change for them wasn't distant and in the future. It was happening right here, right now. They would be talking about glaciers melting, natural springs drying. So for me, coming from the plains, I think it was a very nice insight, I guess, and a learning experience. So I did a lot of that sometime, and then had a slight feeling of not knowing enough to propose solutions. There was this tension of, I need to learn some more, I need to study further. And I decided to do a PhD it was on climate change adaptation at the University of Reading in the UK. And they have a great program in the School of Agriculture Policy and Development, which focuses on climate variability, water scarcity, drought, things like that. And I ended up doing a PhD looking at how farmers are adapting to climate change and climate variability in Rajasthan. Initial ideas, I remember I had wanted to compare hot deserts and cold deserts in India. So cold deserts are places like Ladakh and hot deserts are places like Rajasthan. But very prudently, my supervisor told me that's taking on too much. If you're going to do deep ethnographic work, better to focus on one area. And I chose to do that. So I spent a year living with farmers in South Rajasthan, trying to understand really what are their perceptions of risk. When we talk about climate change, what are the indicators they are using really to think about changing weather patterns, erratic rainfall, and then why are some people choosing to adapt to this change while others aren't? So really understanding the drivers of why people maybe invest in something like drip irrigation, or why certain people just don't do that, and how does local knowledge and indigenous knowledge play a role in all of that. I also then went on to look at how government programs like watershed development schemes, there are these large national schemes that India has right from the 1960s and 70s. Is that really helping people adapt to climate change on the ground? So that was, again, a tremendous learning experience. And after that, I was looking for opportunities to come back to India, because for me personally, it was a dissonance to be sitting in the UK and writing about and learning about these topics. I'm also very keen on building knowledge and capacity in our own country around these topics, just because although now there's a lot more, at that time there weren't a lot of people working on this. I came back and joined IIHS, where I work currently, the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. IIHS focuses on urban issues and urban India. But at that time, they had a very large project, a 5-year-long project on adaptation in Asia and Africa. So at that point, I think it was the largest adaptation project that was ongoing in the world. So again, it was a good way to continue my PhD work. It almost felt like a second PhD. It was so long and quite intense. But this time we were working in a totally different geography. So we were working in Karnataka, Maharashtra, and Tamil Nadu. So semi-arid regions in these states, and trying to understand how is climate change affecting both urban and rural areas, and then what are people doing about that? What are the barriers and enablers, again, to adapting? What was useful here is I was able to build out work on rural to urban migration, which we're seeing a lot of. And many people say that it's climate driven, but we showed that there are multiple factors. It is climate driven, of course, but there are also non-climatic factors. People just want to move to cities. There are aspirations. There are, the bright lights of the city and all of that. So I built out a lot of work on climate change and migration as part of my postdoc first, and then I've continued working at IHS on a range of projects, I guess, and also, of course, teaching at IHS. We do a lot of training for government officials, for postgrad level students. So it's been a nice mix of getting time to do one's research and also trying to, add on knowledge and build capacities of people. So that's really been my journey. It's been very interdisciplinary, and I often struggle when people ask me, what's your training? And I'm a botanist turned social scientist who now works on climate change adaptation. It's not easy. And I've also grown up in many, I've worked in many places. I spent my childhood first in Missouri and then in Gwalior, where I was studying, and then in Delhi for my postgrad. So I think this problem of being a Jane of all trades is like across my personal and professional life, I would say. Yeah.
I have a slightly different, if not unrelated, question. And I love to ask this question, especially to women professionals. The area that you are in, as my understanding or experience goes, is quite devoid of women. So as a professional, how has your experience been, working in an area which does not have much women? Second, as you mentioned, your initial years were on working in rural areas as well. And, I can't fail to remember there was this, I met a women sugar trader some years back, and she said that, whenever she would go and meet all these farmers and villagers, they would just shun her, a girl has come to explain us how we should do farming. So it makes me wonder, how has your experience been, first, to work in an area like this, second, to go out, to the hinterlands of this country and try to make sense of what is happening to these people. Can you tell us?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think your identity as a woman is always mediating everything you do, right? I mean, personally and professionally. So during my PhD research, actually, because I was living for a year in this district called Pratapgarh in Rajasthan, which is a tribal dominated district. It is seen as not a common place to go to do your research, and everyone typically goes to Jaipur and Udaipur and those places to do their field work. And I did face barriers, not so much from the villages, actually. I think in the villages, there's actually being a woman allows you entry into certain spaces that men can't go into. So I used to be hanging around with women when they used to be cooking their evening meal, for example. Because I was young, they also sort of adopted me as like a daughter in some way. So they allowed me that entry. But it was the men, especially in government offices, where I felt that there were lots of barriers. So imagine talking to an engineer in PWD department, the Public Works department, who just don't take you seriously. And it took a lot of relationship building, I think. Also, having the tag of being part of an international university helped. And I used that despite not wanting to. I think they're just tools and techniques you use to get your data. They also, I think, just perseverance. I used to just keep visiting these offices and hanging around them, making friends with the peons. And that was one way of getting entry into these places. But it is tough. And now I feel that now that I'm working in this space, there are a lot more women, of course, especially on climate change adaptation. The climate sciences and the mitigation space in India is still very male dominated. So climate change adaptation, definitely a lot more women. I know phenomenal colleagues like Dr. Aditi Mukherjee at IWMI, Dr. Purnamita Dasgupta. There are these people who have paved the way, I think, for people like me now. They've opened spaces up. But also, thankfully, at IHS, I've had good male mentors, I would say. The director at IHS, Aruma Ravi, has created a very conducive space for women to take up leadership positions. And that helps. It allows you to reach your potential, I guess. I still find a lot of resistance in government offices and just the structures of navigating, the ministries, and they're very male dominated still. So it's a constant struggle, but that's part of one's experience of being a female scientist, I guess. And it's also, I've been talking about this a bit, that it also leads to a sort of personal second guessing, where when I am invited to places like the IPCC or any other large scientific assessments, you often wonder if you're being called for your research expertise or you're being called to fill in the quota of being a woman from a developing country. So that second guessing is quite detrimental to your mental health, I guess. But you learn to live with it, and you learn to, I guess, navigate these spaces. Yeah, it's not easy, but I think there are many more women now, and I hope that many people I have mentored also can enter these spaces. So there's hope.
Okay. I wanted to get into the topic, but this is so fascinating insights. And while you were speaking, I was just thinking that you have done research, you've done implementation work, and now you're also like part of providing training and capacity building, which I think for a country like India, or like generally for Global South, is so critical. I mean, while I believe that finance is important and so are policies, but like to train and like get people to actually implement those things is so important. Which of these among this has been the most challenging? I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a really good question, I think. Because I'm trained as a researcher, I think research comes easy, or at least easier than the other bits of work I do. Capacity building, what I find it very exciting. It's really nice to be able to bring some of your research findings and case studies into capacity building, these workshops that we hold and things like that. But there's still a long way to go, I feel, in sustained capacity building. So typically what we are asked to do is do a one-day workshop here, do a week-long training, and that's just not sustainable. You can talk about climate change and mainstreaming adaptation and development, in an hour-long or a day-long workshop, but that doesn't really lead to behaviors and thinking changing. So that to me is still, it always leaves me with a sense of, I wish we had more time, I wish we had more space to build capacities over the long term. So that's something I hope that we can in the future in India. And I see there is increasing interest in doing that, at least from the governments. The NGO sector actually is quite good in that regard. I mean, NGOs in India at least have been working on, if not climate change, weather-related extreme events for a very long time. I mean, you talk to anyone in NGOs, they are able to articulate these things much better than the researchers actually. So I feel that the capacity building side of things needs a lot more work. It's much more challenging for me. It's also tailoring your very research and evidence-centric ways of knowing to different audiences. I've been also doing some lectures for school children, and just, how do you speak to school children about climate change? And how do you, when they ask for solutions, they have to be solutions that school children can implement. So it's just tailoring to different audiences is also a challenge for, I think, researchers who are so used to writing their journal articles and their policy briefs and all of that.
That's excellent. I mean, I really have a lot of questions, but I think for the sake of time, I'll get into the topic because I have a lot of questions in that front also. Before we really get into like what the report had and, what the report covered and stuff, can you just like briefly explain the process of IPCC, how it works, how many scientists were involved in the current report? How did you conduct research? Do you actually do original research, or you actually compile peer-reviewed literature? And finally, how do you get approvals of so many governments? So just explain briefly, how does the whole orbit of IPCC reports work?
Yeah, I think when you get into the IPCC, you realize how complex it is. But yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So just to start off, of course, the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So many people don't focus on this aspect of intergovernmental. So it basically means that it's the scientific body of the United Nations that is responsible for talking about the scientific evidence on human-induced climate change. And there is a range within those words. The IPCC was set up in 1988 by the World Meteorological Organization. And what it did, every 7 years, every 5 to 7 years, the IPCC comes out with a set of reports, which are called the assessment reports. Right now, the reports that are coming out, there was one last year and one this year, which I was part of, and there's a third one coming out in April. These are part of the assessment report 6 cycles. So there have already been 5 cycles of the IPCC reports coming out. This is the 6th cycle. The way they are divided up is the first working group talks about the physical basis, the physical science on climate change. So they will be typically climate scientists and modelers trying to talk about how the monsoons are changing, to what extent sea level is rising, glacier melting, things like that. So the physical aspects of climate change, I guess. And they do it at a global level, but they also have regional assessments within that. The second working group, which I'm a part of, is around impacts, adaptation, and vulnerabilities. So looking at the changing climate science from the working group 1, we really pick up those findings and say, how is it going to impact human beings and natural systems? So oceans and forests and all the natural systems, really. And then the third working group focuses on mitigation, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions and how do we do it? How do we pace ourselves? I mean, for common audiences, things like, do we go the way of electric vehicles or do we improve energy efficiency in our buildings? Those are things of working group 3. Apart from these core reports, which happen every 5 to 7 years, there are some special reports that come out. In 2012, I think there was a special report on extreme events, which spoke about, floods and droughts and sea level rise and all of that and how it affects people. In this cycle of assessment report 6, we have three special reports. The first was the monumental 1.5 degree report, which came out in 2018. I was a contributing author on that as well. And I think that really laid out, that was again an explicit ask from the governments from the 2015 COP Conference of Parties at Paris, where they said that, all right, we've agreed to reducing global warming under 2 degrees Celsius and aspirationally to 1.5 degrees. But how do we do it? What are the ways to do it? So as the scientific body of the UN, they turned to the IPCC and said, please make a report on this. And that was the report that the ask was so strong from the governments, but the science was really not there at that point. And so it was a big global initiative. I think everyone who worked on this topic really was publishing papers, trying to write stuff on 1.5 degrees. And the other 2 special reports in this cycle have been one on oceans and cryosphere. It's called SROC, Special Report on Oceans, Cryosphere in a Changing Climate. And the third special report is on land. So it focuses on things like desertification, land use change, and So, all right. So then coming, I think, to this report in particular, which I've been a part of, Working Group 2, which is Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability. The way the IPCC works is, first of all, it doesn't do any of its own research. The IPCC assesses and synthesizes existing peer-reviewed literature, which means we aren't sitting and actually conducting primary research to understand these things. We read thousands of papers to understand what are they saying. Then we have very carefully calibrated language to synthesize it. So it's not just, that's what the IPCC always says, it's not just a review of the literature, which is a summary of what the literature is saying, but it's an assessment. And by assessment, I mean we assign values of confidence to the literature. So when you see an IPCC report, you'll often see things like, at higher warming levels, we are going to see more droughts, high confidence. So the high confidence is actually beneath that word high, that phrasing of high confidence, there'll be thousands of papers to be able to say with a strong degree of certainty that we are very confident about what we are saying here. Whereas in some places we'll see low confidence. So we know that there is a link but we're not very sure how significant it is or how attributable to climate change. So that's where we have a low confidence statement. And low confidence doesn't always mean that it's not happening. It just means that we don't have enough literature on it just yet, or the literature doesn't agree with each other. Some studies are saying one thing, others are saying another. So that's what, the process of the IPCC looks like. Also to add, I think you did ask about the plenary approval. So I think the big thing to highlight here is while there are these authors who write the IPCC reports, the final report is actually owned and approved by all the governments that are part of the UN system. So in this report, the Working Group 2 report, we actually had 195 countries sign off on the final summary for policymakers, which is a huge, huge exercise. And I think people don't appreciate the level of commitment, both from the authors, of course, who are writing the report, but also the governments who are signing on to it. Many of them are experts in this field, have been working for decades on climate change. So they really know the science well. And they often challenge the authors saying that, all right, you say high confidence, but where is your line of sight? Where are those papers? And we have to be then, explaining that to them to say that we're very sure that we know that this is happening. So in late February, we had two weeks of this approval plenary, this session where we present the findings of the IPCC in a summary for policymakers. I think it's a 33-page document. And then we go line by line with all the governments where they give comments and then we respond to those comments. It's a grueling experience because you have to be up at all. Yeah, we were sleeping. I think we were working 18 to 20 hours a day trying to get this through. It's usually an in-person event. So for the 1.5 degree report, we had the approval plenary in South Korea, which was a 1-week thing. But just because of COVID, we've had to move online, which has been a whole different experience, I think, both for the governments and for the authors. Also, it's difficult to discuss things with your authors when you're online. So we had set up Slack channels where the authors would be discussing how to deal with some of the government queries, which was good. I mean, I think it just shows that how human beings can adapt to anything, really. So we managed that quite well. And just to say, I think a final thing on this is many people ask me about how IPCC authors are chosen. How do you become part of it? And in this particular report, there were around 270 authors from 67 countries that were part of it. The way it's done is typically national governments recommend or nominate experts from their country to the IPCC, and then the IPCC bureau sits and decides who's going to be brought in. They're very careful about regional coverage, so people from developing and developed countries. I don't like these terms, but that's the terminology the IPCC uses. Also, maintaining gender balance. The IPCC was very white male dominated in the early reports, and that has changed a lot, especially in our Working Group 2, where we have around, I think, 41% women authors. And apart from the national government route, we also have what we call observer organizations. So they are civil society organizations or big think tanks that apply for observer status, and they can also nominate authors. So that's another way through which authors brought into the IPCC.
Thank you for explaining that, because I've been wanting to understand the whole process for quite some time. You go through that bulky report and it obviously I think about it, that how does this whole process takes place? So thank you for explaining that. Now let me go through some of the headline themes that were part of this IPCC Working Group 2 report. As far as my understanding goes, and I would love that if you can elaborate on that, is that now with high confidence, the report has indicated that there is irreversible impact of climate change on human health, on terrestrial, coastal ecosystem, freshwater ecosystem, and agriculture, coastal areas, fisheries. These would be in the first line of impact, and not to mention an increased amount of pandemics, endemics starting because of climate change. So can you elaborate on these key themes that the report has offered this time to us?
Yeah, I think so. There is, with a great deal of certainty, we can say now that already at this point in time, we are already seeing very high impacts because of anthropogenic climate change. So climate change that is human induced. And just to give some background right now, what the Working Group 1 had showed us that already the Earth has warmed to 1.1 degrees Celsius. What that means is that if you look at the temperatures in the 1880s and compare it to today, there's been an average warming of 1.1 degrees. And I want to highlight this average because it's a global average that we're talking about. When you look at it locally, it means very different things. So the Arctic, for example, has already warmed by 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, even at this global average of 1.1 degrees. In India, we see last year, our Ministry of Earth Sciences had released a very strong assessment, which shows that in India, we've seen a 0.9 degrees Celsius increase already. What the report then goes on to say is that, of course, you can have impacts of 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, depending on how fast we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So, yeah, as you rightly, I think, pointed out, already we are seeing impacts, first order impacts. So things like more floods, more droughts, more sea level rise, of course, and a range of other things like permafrost thaw, ice on the land is thawing and melting. And all of these impacts, if you look at them together, they are leading to some irreversible changes, both in natural and human systems. So you rightly mentioned things like livelihoods getting affected, any natural resource dependent livelihood. So think about agriculture, think about fisheries. They are all already seeing impacts of climate change. What we are also saying very clearly is that at higher warming levels, these impacts are only going to become more severe. We have very clear data to show that agriculture is going to be affected through more erratic rainfall, changes in the temperature, which will affect how crop yields are. So there are these, or even things like certain tree species are moving further up north to deal with this changing temperature profile. So I think there are very clear impacts. There are some particular species and systems that are almost reaching their limits. So coral reefs is a classic example. At 1.5 degrees, we show that 90% of all coral reefs will die out. They'll be bleached. So there are some systems that are going to really hit their limits in terms of survivability. And here, maybe just to make it a little more real, because when people talk about coral reefs, at least for an Indian audience, I think it makes more sense for a Pacific and Australian audience to talk about coral reefs. But often in India, people say, what does it mean for me when you talk about 1.5 degrees? And I often take the example of heat, extreme heat. We in India have always been dealing with heat, and we feel that we are well adapted to it. It's almost like a false sense of bravado that we have that, it'll get warmer, but we can deal with it. But what we talk about in the report is this idea of wet bulb temperatures. So usually when you just look at the temperature outside and you say it's 30 degrees or 40 degrees, that's a temperature reading. But wet bulb temperatures are when you bring heat and humidity together. And that's what we show. Human physiology studies have shown that a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees is devastating for human beings. We cannot survive that. 6 hours at a 35-degree wet bulb temperature means death for human beings, a healthy human being. Already, Indian cities in particular are seeing 24 to 26 degrees of wet bulb temperatures. This is where we are at right now, especially our coastal cities, because they trap heat and they're also wet. So tropical cities in particular are seeing this. And our projections show that by mid-century, which is 2050, if we continue warming as we do, continue emitting as we do, most of India is going to be seeing wet bulb temperatures of 32 to 34 degrees Celsius. So that is devastating if you think of the impacts on how we live, how we work, the kind of cooling requirements our country will need, and just mortality, people dying. And especially, it's also important, I think, to highlight here that these kinds of impacts are not felt by everyone similarly. If you are people who can afford air conditioners, which are not a great strategy for cooling at a large scale, but if you can afford any kind of cooling devices, you can still deal with that wet bulb temperature. But if you are working outdoors, if you're a construction worker, if you're living in tin sheds that many of our informal settlements are made of, those kind of impacts are going to be devastating and lead to a lot of mortality. So I think it's important to understand that there are very real and significant impacts at higher warming levels. The report clearly shows that. The second thing I do want to mention is that, and which is very strongly, again, assessed in this report, is this idea of compounding risk. So gone are the days when we had one drought and one flood and they came at different times. This compounding risk is this idea of multiple hazards coming simultaneously. And we don't have the systems to deal with that. That is what is going to be the breaking point, I think, for many places, of course, in India, but also globally. So you can, again, an example would be, I take the example of Chennai in South India, where you have water scarcity, ongoing water scarcity, but you also have sea level rise and coastal flooding happening. So you've got all these things happening simultaneously. How do you deal with that? So the report very clearly has examples of these compounding impacts and risks. And then finally, this idea of cascading risks. So what happens in one location or one sector can cascade out to other places. And I think there's this very illustrative example from Thailand, where I think in 2011, there was a huge flooding event. It was attributed to climate change, like just the scale and the intensity of the flood. And that had ripple effects on the global supply chains for semiconductors. So Thailand supplies so many semiconductors globally. So there was a huge dip in semiconductors. It rippled out into all the industries that need semiconductors. And I think the prices of hard disks and things like that went up by 100% or 190% or something. So just understanding that what happens in one place can cascade out to other places as well. So when people often pick up these numbers of, oh, Mumbai is going to go underwater, but what happens in Mumbai is not going to stay in Mumbai. It's just because of what Mumbai is, it links to rural areas as well. So just to understand that idea of cascading risk as well, I think is very important.
That's excellent. This is more of my question out of curiosity rather than like the IPCC itself. But, there's always this debate that, let's say, there's drought in Maharashtra or Karnataka or be it any region, or there's floods in coastal cities. Is the science now advanced enough to say, yes, that particular flood is because of climate change? I mean, of course, there's also adaptation, which we'll talk about in detail, but like how confident is the science to attribute individual events to sort of climate change?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question because a lot of people ask that often. So this field of attributing particular single events to climate change and human-induced climate change is the domain of Working Group 1, and it's called attribution science, where people do assess what, sort of like a if-then kind of scenarios that if there wasn't any climate change, then what would have this event looked like? And with climate change, what does it look like? So I think for particular single events like the wildfires in Australia, or even I think for the Uttarakhand floods that happened recently, those kinds of single rapid onset events, people are able to attribute them very clearly with high confidence to climate change. But for slower events like drought is a classic example. It's much more difficult methodologically to do it. There are advances in that, but I have always been saying, this is my personal opinion, that perhaps we don't need to be so hung up on this whole idea of attributing it to climate change. We know that these are happening. There are observed impacts already. And we also know very clearly that climatic and non-climatic things are coming together to shape these events. So a flood. There are, in a city, for example, of course, rainfall patterns are changing because of climate change. And that is shaping how rainfall patterns are changing. But also, there are just the ways our cities are being built on wetlands, just the process of bad urbanization, which is exacerbating those. So those two things are coming together. So I think teasing out how much of it is climate change induced and how much of it is just bad development is quite difficult to do, especially in cities, I feel. But that should not stop us from acting still. I mean, just because we can't attribute it with high confidence to a particular climate driver doesn't mean that it sort of shouldn't give governments and people chance to avoid adapting to it. So yes, the attribution science is moving ahead, I think, very rapidly. There are lots of people working on this, but there's still a long way to go, especially on slow onset events. Yeah.
Great. Now let's dive into the impacts, right? And there's so many themes in that report. There's like themes around like how humans would be impacted, how animals would be impacted, etc. But let's focus on one thing in particular, which I think Dr. Aditi, who was in our episode a few months back, she really said that and it it really captured my imagination because I work in mitigation. So like what she said is that, what CO2 is for mitigation, water is for adaptation. I want to explore like, what is the role of water in terms of like, what does the report highlight regarding like water in India? And if you can talk more of that in terms of like how water prepared India is and what the impacts of that would be.
Yeah, I think it's, as Aditi said, I mean, water is everything to adaptation, really. I mean, what the report very clearly again shows is that there are going to be two kinds of problems associated with water. In some places, there's going to be too much of it, and in some places, too little of it. So on the one hand, water scarcity, on the other hand, flooding and cyclones and storm surges and all of that. Chapter 4 of the report really is on water, and she led that chapter actually with Dr. Martina as well. So I think one of the key things that comes out is, first of all, India is already facing tremendous water scarcity. And as we go forward, we're going to see large numbers of people living in water scarcity. So I think the numbers that the report highlights is almost 40% of all Indians will be facing acute water scarcity by 2050 if we continue emitting as we are currently. Also, what is important to understand is, where is India's water coming from? And the Himalayan glaciers are a source of 3 very big rivers for us: Indus, Brahmaputra, and Ganga. And we know very clearly, the Working Group 1 report says that the Himalayan glaciers are going to see increasing melting happening, snow melt, which means that in the short term, we might see actually increased flow in these rivers, which might lead to flooding downstream. And then over a long time, there'll be a shrinking of these rivers. And I think in this regard, the studies show that in the Indus Basin in particular, there's going to be a very rapid shrinking of the river and its tributaries. So you can only imagine the knock-on effects of that for the whole Indo-Gangetic plain. I mean, 1.9 billion people across all the South Asian countries, not only in India, dependent on these for agriculture, for other livelihoods like fishing and things like that. Also, industries are dependent on these rivers for cooling and other needs. So I think there's really significant and severe impacts, second-order impacts that are going to be seen across the Indo-Gangetic plain. At higher warming levels, I think at 2 degrees Celsius by mid-century to end century, which is 2050 to 2100, there's expected to see a 20% decrease in just snow melt from the Himalayan glaciers. So just to give you an idea of the enormity of the problem, I think. And some of the findings, I guess, that the report highlights are, in particular, because the evidence is very strong, is on particular crops. So when you see more erratic rainfall, less river flow, and also higher temperatures, all of these things combine together to reduce yields of rice, of wheat, and of maize, which are staple crops for our country. So I think there's that very clear impact on agriculture and crop yields, and then as a result on food security or insecurity, I guess, in this case. I guess apart from that, so that's the part of less water. And again, in chapter 4, I think they highlight the non-climatic drivers as well. So groundwater is a classic example where just over-extraction is leading to just a changing water availability situation. So while you have decreasing rainfall or more erratic rainfall from one side, you've got because of that over-extraction of groundwater, and then all of that is coming together to make agriculture just a more risky enterprise, I would say. And a third order impact, if we want to delve into that, is this, because agriculture is just becoming less remunerative, people are then choosing to move from rural areas to urban areas. And that's a whole other story of migration and often very vulnerable people moving across rural to urban India, I guess. So that's the problem of less water. But then we also have India just is blessed or cursed with the geography it is. And so we also have the problem of too much water. So our coastal cities, or not only coastal cities, I would say just coastal settlements or even villages, are facing increasing coastal flooding, higher storm surges, so just waves that come up that are very high and then flood these coastal areas. And then a somewhat smaller but also significant impact through sea level rise. So just sea levels rising and that leading to flooding. If we look at the numbers, again, I think South Asia concentrates the most number of people who are exposed to coastal flooding by mid and end century again. some of it is already locked in. Even if we start mitigating very significantly today, sea levels are going to rise. And that's what is the thing that's less appreciated, that some of these things already happening and will continue to happen even if we change our behaviors right now. So we just have to adapt. Gone are the days of thinking that we'll mitigate and hopefully then adapt to impacts. We just have to do both of them now together. So there are some examples of sea level rise and coastal flooding, at least for the big cities in India. So Mumbai, Calcutta and Chennai, Visakhapatnam, Kochi, these are some cities that we pull out as particularly exposed to coastal flooding. And there are some numbers also on the economic damages of what this will do to our critical infrastructure, like power plants and things like that, which is less spoken about, I think, usually in Working Group 2 and adaptation, among adaptation folks. But I think it's also a significant thing that that the report highlights and we need to be thinking about. So critical infrastructure, I'm thinking of things like power lines, roads, power plants, those kind of things are also going to be seeing, increasing impacts of these disasters. So I think that's how this idea of too much water and too little water is just shaping the risk space that we are inhabiting now.
Thank you for that. And I should, full disclosure here, after I read this report, I was actually very depressed because there's not a single area that's mentioned which can get away with, climate risk. Each and every part of the economy of the human ecosystem, animal forest ecosystem is getting impacted. And good you mentioned India-related examples, Indo-Gangetic plains and everything, because that's where I was heading my next question to. The report, there's this interesting paragraph in the report, and I'll quote that as it is, that while adaptation efforts are underway, they are often fragmented, small in scale, incremental, sector-specific, designed to respond to current impacts or near-term risks, and focus more on planning rather than implementation. Now, that is something that we see whenever there's a mishap or a climate hazard happens in the country. It is mostly done to just wrap up the immediate, efforts to tackle the situation that has emerged rather than looking into long-term solutions to let it never happen again. So, what are the key constraints that you can explain for large-scale adaptation with regards to India? And, how can financial, government or institutional and policy can be designed to tackle all these large-scale adaptation efforts?
Yeah, I think that's a really nice entry into this idea of adaptation and moving from this whole risk and impacts doom and gloom story to slightly more hopeful things around solutions and adaptation. So thanks for that question. As you rightly said, and the quote that you mentioned from the report, we are already seeing a lot of adaptation planning. So there are national action plans on adaptation. There are resilience plans at city levels also. There are particular sector-focused plans on, say, agriculture, adapting agriculture to climate change, but maybe key infrastructures to climate change. But again, all of this tends to be, as you said from the report, very sectors focused and very single risk focused. So they'll be adapting to water scarcity or adapting to a high flood event, but not looking at what I said earlier about compounding risks and impacts. So I think that is one big gap. And what this does is when you tend to focus on single hazards, you are missing an opportunity to really transform the way your systems are functioning. And that's what we talk about, this need for transformational adaptation, where you're not just doing incremental bits and pieces here and there, but actually transforming the way your systems are functioning. And we don't see a lot of evidence on this. We actually we wanted to do a full assessment of examples of transformational adaptation. We just didn't find enough in the literature to highlight some of those examples. To give you an idea from cities and urban adaptation, just because they're very well reported in the literature, we found that there's one paper by Malcolm Arias and his authors where they look at adaptation planning in cities across the world, and they find that 57% of all adaptation action is in the planning stages. So they'll be thinking about conducting a risk assessment. They'll be planning to do certain things and have like a heat adaptation plan or something like that, but then not moving from that planning stage to an implementation stage. Only 43% of those cities that they had focused on globally actually went into the implementation stage. So there's this big adaptation gap. That's what we call it in the report, between planning and implementation. This, we say, has to be, of course, narrowed significantly. And again, the urgency of the whole thing is what we keep on highlighting, that you need to reduce this adaptation gap now. Coming to India, I think the evidence is mixed. If you look on paper, we do have good programs and policies to deal with adaptation. We have, I'm sure you all are, of course, very familiar with the idea of, the tiers of adaptation or climate change planning that we have in the country. We've got a national action plan on climate change. Then we have state action plans on climate change. Each state makes their own documents really on how they're going to deal with climate change. What we have seen in other assessments, not in the IPCC, but my own research has shown that a lot of it focuses on mitigation. The state action plans are very, very mitigation centric. India as a country has been focused much more on mitigation, and I think within mitigation, energy transitions to a large degree, and we really fail to see how we can adapt. The adaptation strategies that our national and state action plans do talk about, they tend to, again, focus on the more visible disasters, so flooding and to some extent droughts. But there are other disasters that are taking place, heat. Only more recently has India started working more significantly on extreme heat, disease incidents, which I don't think we've spoken about, but just the changing nature of vector-borne diseases like dengue and malaria. We know from our personal experience that is just increasing in India, but there are very clear indications in the climate models that both the spread of these diseases as well as the number of people who will be affected by them is going to change rapidly. So how are we adapting to those kind of things? It's not there very clearly right now in current state action plans. And the big gap, I feel, is also around understanding that not everyone, while everyone is affected, I know what you said, Shreya, about it can be quite overwhelming sometimes when you see just every place and every system is being affected. We are not recognizing, I think, clearly in our policy that not everyone is affected equally. Based on your gender, your caste, your income, your livelihood, certain people are more vulnerable to these impacts. And our policies are still very homogeneous. They don't target particular vulnerable groups. If they do target them, we had done one assessment of how the SAPCCs look at gender. And we just find that there's this complete framing of women as being victims of climate change, as being most vulnerable, without recognizing that women also hold a lot of agency and a lot of ability to adapt to climate change. So you need to start thinking in a slightly different way. We're not just talking about women as the most vulnerable, but also understanding that they can be part of the solution. So those kinds of changes are really needed in our policies. And then finally, I think I'd like to say you do mention this idea of what are the institutional and policy constraints, right? And I feel the biggest thing is that we just don't have the capacities, institutional capacities for long-term planning. So we are focusing, as you said, on single events in the short term, often in a reactive manner, but not forward-looking planning, that we know that these risks are going to increase. How do we do it? We should learn from a country like Bangladesh. They have a Bangladesh Delta plan that goes up to 2100. It's a 100-year plan where they know that sea level rise is going to affect them. They know that they have large populations exposed to flooding. So they're saying, let's think about 100-year planning instead of 2-year, 5-year flood management plans. So I feel that those are the kinds of things we need to start thinking of. And capacity building is the biggest gap. Of course, financial constraints are there, but I think we have enough evidence to show that you can bring both your development priorities and your adaptation actions together. So you can, add on to existing projects. Like NREGA is a classic example, National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which really is already trying to give people jobs, but you can also have some climate adaptation or climate proofing strategies, like building rainwater harvesting structures and things like that through NREGA to also meet some of your climate adaptation goals. So I think there are examples that are happening in India, but the scale and speed of it really needs to be ramped up. It's very insufficient at this point.
That's a perfect answer for my next question, which one of the most intriguing things for me in this report was the concept of maladaptation, which I think before we were chatting and you mentioned that there's some literature on that. But to me, who is not looking at adaptation and, the mostly focused on the mitigation side, this whole concept of maladaptation is like really fascinating. So I'm curious, like, can you explain more about what that means? Perhaps if appropriate, it would be great to get some live examples of what that means, especially in the context of India, because I think if we have a short-term vision, likely or not, like there's a very high likelihood that our adaptation would be quite maladaptation rather than you're not thinking of long-term. So yeah, I would love to hear some examples. First the concept and then some examples.
That's a great question again, because this report really breaks new ground in the space of maladaptation. So the concept itself is basically what is maladaptation? Maladaptation is an unintended negative consequence of adaptation. So it's the flip side of what you want. You ideally want that by the end of, through some interventions, and you are able to adapt to these growing risks. But maladaptation is this idea that in spite of good intentions, you put in some, on-ground projects, and then you realize you've actually had negative consequences. By that, I mean, you could have increased the risk instead of decreasing risk for people. You could have degraded some ecosystems rather than helping them. Or you could, in some cases, also have higher greenhouse gas emissions because of an adaptation strategy that you had not intended to. So you are undoing some of the good work that's being done elsewhere. And one of the other things that we add on in this is maladaptation can also mean increasing inequities. So you can make particular groups of people adapt, but some people who were as it is vulnerable, you're increasing their vulnerability. So that's what the idea of maladaptation really captures. Now, in earlier reports, we have discussed maladaptation. The assessment report 5 did define maladaptation and give a few examples. But now, in the past 5 to 7 years, I think the evidence on maladaptation has really gone up. And by that, I mean, we have enough examples of adaptation going really bad. And so we could synthesize those, assess them, and put them into the report. To give you some concrete examples, one example that keeps coming up, I think, across the world really is focusing on infrastructural solutions to climate hazards. A classic example is putting in seawalls to deal with sea level rise and just coastal flooding. So you build structures, hard structures that keep the water out. The Netherlands is a great example of how they've done this very successfully for centuries, actually. But what that does is it locks us into certain pathways. So once you build a seawall, it affects the local ecosystem. It affects just the ocean chemistry, and as a result affects fishes, and then affects livelihoods that depend on fishing. So there are these unintended consequences of such infrastructural solutions. That's one example. The second one, I think closer home in India, is this push that the government has had, which was in theory a good idea, of building farm ponds. Farm ponds were these structures that the government provided a lot of subsidy for to help provide what we call protective irrigation. So farmers that depend on rainfall for irrigation, there are periods when the rains are, there are these dry spells within the monsoon, and farmers need water to irrigate their crops. And the solution to this was, let's build water harvesting structures on farms so that people have that water to tide over these dry spells. In theory, it's a great idea. It is still spoken about as an adaptation strategy. A lot of funding was given to groups of farmers to set up these water ponds where you dig a piece, quite a large area, and then line it with plastic sheets so that you can store that water. What ended up happening is, and they are rainwater harvesting structures. So ideally, when there's a lot of rain falling, you harvest that water, use it. What happened is that there's not enough rain that's falling to fill these farm ponds, but it helps for a farmer to have this captured water. And so farmers started digging wells to extract groundwater and then fill these farm ponds. Now, only farmers who have a lot of money, who have the social capital to do this, are able to dig those wells, who can take loans, are able to dig the wells and fill the farm ponds. But what they are doing is reducing groundwater. And so other farmers who perhaps only had groundwater to rely on, they are now not able to use that water. So it was a complete, I would say, I mean, in the short term, it worked well. Many people actually were able to grow better, have better yields. But if you look at it in the long term, you've just really spoiled the water tables, local water tables. You have locked in again people into this dependency on farm ponds. So it's been, in that sense, if you look at it at a wider ecological scale, longer time scale, you see that it's been maladaptive in many places. And now that people have, again, these kind of interventions, because we aren't thinking long term, we're not thinking of the ripple effects. So what happened is that many farmers who were growing drought resilient crops, like I'll give the example of Karnataka, where people grow millets like ragi and jowar. So they were growing crops that were suited to this climate, that were suited to less water. But with the introduction of farm ponds, what happened is that people saw that we have more water and we can grow more water intensive crops like tomatoes and other vegetables and flowers also for export. And now that you've changed the whole cropping pattern to this more water intensive situation, no farmer is going to go back to ragi and jowar. So it's very tough. These maladaptive outcomes can really lock you in for long time periods. And I don't see a way out. So it's better that we proactively think about the negative consequences rather than figuring it out by trial and error and then locking us into these things.
Great. That brings me to a very important question, and also, in a sense, would summarize this very, very insightful discussion. Is that India, thanks to its geography, stands at a very high risk when compared to other countries due to climate risk. And then at the same time, we stand at a position where our development is just going to go up. We have this very, very ambitious developmental goals. And then at the same time, we have to plan for climate resilient development. We have to meet our SDG goals. So in middle of this, what do you propose that India should do? How does it balances its own developmental needs and climate adaptation efforts, or rather climate resilient development? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I think that's really the question of the hour, right? Especially for countries like India. We just have so many development deficits that we need to meet, from poverty to like all the SDGs, I would say, all the sustainable development goals, alleviating poverty, providing jobs, having more equal and sustainable cities. There's so many of them. And how do we do this in a changing climate? So what the IPCC report does is, for the first time really, is assess or map this whole solution space. If we are to do adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development together, how do we do it? And the idea that they bring about is this idea of climate resilient development. So the assessment that we did is, and I feel it's also quite an innovation methodologically, for the first time the IPCC has done it, where we assess the feasibility of different adaptation options. What we find is that we do, to balance the whole, I guess to bring some hope into the whole story, we do show that there are a range of feasible adaptation options. So by feasible, I mean possible or implementable adaptation options that we can implement right now. Examples of those are things like having early warning systems, well-functioning early warning systems. We already have a great infrastructure in India around early warning systems. I think India is actually quite a front runner in this space. Having things like urban green infrastructure. So what that means is having trees in cities. They provide a lot of adaptation benefits. So we do an assessment of the different adaptation options and their feasibility. We also show that what are the barriers to these adaptation options. They can be governance-related barriers, social barriers, things like acceptability. Are people really ready to implement these? So social acceptability, technological feasibility. So we have a range of, there are 6 dimensions across which we assess the feasibility. And then the innovation really is we map this to whether they have synergies and trade-offs with mitigation. Because as you rightly said, I mean, we aren't doing these in silos. As a government, you have to do adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development together. So we do map which adaptation options have benefits for mitigation. So things like forest-based adaptation strategies that can sequester carbon as well. Those are some examples that we show. Or urban greening, where you are providing cooling effects of having urban parks and urban trees in cities. They can also capture rainwater and reduce floods, but they also sequester carbon. So there are some examples that we showcase have strong synergies with mitigation. And then finally, we do an assessment of which of these strategies lead to very strong benefits for particular SDGs. And again, we show that strategies that are more nature-based, that focus on a whole range of systems rather than single sectors, they have more benefits for the Sustainable Development Goals. So we do give an idea of the kinds of things that governments can implement that will meet all these goals. The barriers remain, again, on the finance, on the governance, on the long-term planning, and we discuss them, we call them enabling conditions in the report. There are 6 of them. Like even just technology transfer and capacity building around that. So there are feasible solutions, but of course there are significant constraints. And maybe just to add, one of the things I do want to say here, and it links back to the conversation on maladaptation, is right now we're focusing so much on infrastructural solutions like building seawalls or building buildings a certain way that we tend to lull people into a false sense of security. So if you have a seawall in a coastal area, you feel that, all right, we are implementing adaptation. So it's not only planning. So it's good. And people are lulled into the security and tend to focus on building their livelihoods, investing in their houses in those areas. But that can really lead to very large and unimaginable impacts, I think, in the future. So that when we are choosing these solutions and these sets of solutions, we need to really think about that longer term impact that can be there. And finally, I'll say one of the levers of change that we talk about in the report is on education and behavioral change. It's something that's not been picked up much, but just we talk about institutional capacity building, which might be of governments and implementing agencies, but there needs to be a broader social movement on climate change and understanding how you can move from being extremely overwhelmed and depressed about the situation we are in and where we are headed to actually now thinking about what can we as people, as individuals or as communities do about it. And here we highlight this idea of climate literacy. You need to, first of all, equip yourself with an understanding of the changing climate, and then equip yourself with some solutions you can do as a person or maybe as part of the networks you are in. We call this behavioral change, which is that or societal change, where you change people's behaviors to actually do something that's more positive. And they can be small. I think the mitigation folks have a lot on behavioral change, which is like you shift to electric vehicles, you reduce food waste. But on the adaptation side, this is still something that's new. And an example of that would be when you do get a climate forecast, what do you do about it? How do you use that information to change your behavior? Or why should you invest in risk insurance, climate risk insurance? Those kinds of things, I think, are the ways forward that we have really. Yeah.
I must say that this has been such an enlightening episode. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chandni. It was great having you. And we would love to have you again because there is still so many things that the time did not allow us, but we would definitely love to have another episode with you. And thank you so much again.
Thank you so much. Lovely to speak to all of you.
Thank you for listening to the India Energy Hour. Subscribe to this channel to never miss an update. To drop us a feedback, visit our website or write to us at theindiaenergyhour@gmail.com. We are on Twitter. You can follow at TIEH_podcast and get in touch with the two hosts at Shreya_Jay and at Sandeep Pai with double I.